This episode of The Bill and Callie Show is brought to you by, since 1984, Miles Books has been the region's family-run independent bookstore with over 72,000 titles of new, used, and antique books, and the ability to find and order rare or specialized titles. Certified book appraisals are also available. Located in downtown Highland on Jewett Avenue. Follow them on Facebook for sales, author book signings, and special events.
Hello and welcome to our show. We're coming to you today from Miles Books in Highland, Indiana. With us, we have the proprietor of Miles Books, Demetrius.
Chief cook and bottle washer.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll get back to him shortly because there's going to be an event coming up this weekend that we want to let you know about. And again, our special guest here today is Dan Helpingstine, who is the author of some books that we're going to be talking about. More importantly, we're here to talk about the 1919 Black Sox Scandal, which is his latest book. So welcome to our show, Dan.
Thanks for having me.
And before we get started on this book, why don't you talk about some of the other books that you've authored that we have here. Actually, I'll hold them up if you want to talk about it. We'll start with this one first.
Okay, the Chicago White Sox 1959 and Beyond is kind of a highlight book. It has different things that we concentrate on. Like, for example, it has a special section on dramatic home runs or dramatic pitching performances. And there's even a section there is if you have a sense of humor. So it takes certain sections and highlights certain small sections of White Sox history.
And you got to realize that some of our listeners are going to be having a sense of humor, realizing that most of this is about White Sox.
Right.
We'll get back to that later. And then one that you co-authored with someone.
Yes, with Demetrius. And this is a nice pictorial history of the town we live in, Highland. And what's really nice about the publisher Arcadia is they specialize in books like this. They like to do local, regional publishing that other publishers obviously don't do. And it's a nice thing to have for local histories to look back at certain things that happen in their town that they normally wouldn't get in the book. I still get people come up to me and say, I remember this, or I remember that, right, because they enjoy looking at these images on the history of the town.
And this particular publisher around here in the region, they have one in Valparaiso, Gary, and so on. And that's what their specialty is to come up with some local author to write about that community. And then we have the South Side Hitman. We're not talking about Al Capone.
No, but there used to be a shirt that advertised the South Side Hitman. It was a White Sox player with a circle of bats making it look like a machine gun, and it says South Side Hitman on the shirt. Yeah. This was one of the most beloved teams of the White Sox until they started winning a little bit. This was a team in 1977 that did one thing. They hit. They could not field, they could not pitch. Somehow they won 90 games.
Was Ron Kittle on that?
No, Ron Kittle
that was prior Ron Kittle. Yeah. That's right.
6 years before Kittle.
Yeah.
They can go into the ninth inning losing 7-1 and win. That's the type of hitting team. That's all you do is hit.
That's true.
Couldn't field, couldn't throw, but they could hit.
And then they got Kittle to follow them up.
How many games did they win their division, the pennant?
No, they won 90 games. They ended up in third place, but they were more fun than a winner, actually.
Okay.
Then you have this book, which is a little bit different topic. That
yes, this is called Dallas Forever Changed, and what this book is about the Kennedy assassination. Not about the assassination itself, but how it affected Dallas and how it changed Dallas forever, and it did. Dallas is still feeling the effects of something that happened over 50 years ago. And they will never be forgotten as a place where John Kennedy was killed, and they are very sensitive about it still, 55 years later.
So this is more not your typical conspiracy theorist. This is written from the perspective of people in Dallas, what they went through, and to be hung upon the notorious thing that this is where one of our presidents were assassinated,
right.
And not only that, but John F. Kennedy, one of the most popular. Now we get to the most recent, which is the Black Sox Scandal. So before we get into your perspective on this book, which you take as obviously you would take a different perspective, why don't we talk about, for some viewers who may not be familiar with this team, what happened during that World Series and why it caused so much controversy that we're still feeling the effects of today.
Yes, we are still feeling the effects. It's true. What happened was that as the 1919 World Series was about to start, the White Sox were considered the favorites. They were considered the Major League Baseball's best team. They had a well-rounded team of pitching and hitting and defense, and most people expected them to win. But right on the first pitch of the first game of the series, Eddie Sycote, their best pitcher, hit the Reds' batter. And that was a signal to the gamblers, the fix is on. And so not the whole team did not conspire to throw the World Series, but 7 or 8 players did. And they did enough to lose that World Series. Like I said, the first pitch, he hit him right in the back, and the gamblers knew that Sycote was going to throw that game, and he did.
Right. And now back in the 1919, the owner at that time, which even present day should bring back some memories, is Charles Kaminsky, right? He was the owner of the White Sox at that time, right?
Yeah, he was the owner, and one thing that makes him different than present-day owners, he was a player first. He was a Major League player before he owned the White Sox. And he owned a minor league team that was actually in St. Paul, Minnesota, and he moved them to Chicago in 1900, and then they established the American League.
Yeah. I just want to bring up his name to give some familiarity to the story. So he was the owner at that time.
Right.
So go on. So there were 8 players that were involved in this scandal.
Right. Well, they were supposed to, what happened was that they were approached for the series, that they told they would get so much money if they threw the series, and what happened was that they needed someone to actually bankroll this, because a lot of the gamblers were small time, and they didn't have the money to pay off the White Sox. So what happened, they got someone to bankroll this to pay the White Sox, and then the gamblers made the money once the series started.
Yeah. Now, one of the myths was now, as we're talking about the pay, during the 1919 season, it was reported that really the Sox were not really underpaid. In fact, it was reported that they had the higher of the payrolls in the entire league back then.
Well, compared to the Cincinnati Reds, their World Series opponent, their payroll was $10,000 more, which back then was a lot of money.
A lot of money.
Yeah. Now it buys a pair of shoes for one of these guys.
Yeah.
Depends.
But the thing is that things have to be looked at a different perspective, too. As far as a couple of things. First of all, even though they were probably the highest paid, some of the White Sox are still underpaid. We probably also would have to analyze baseball economics and figure were they really paid in relation to the money they helped generate. It's one thing to say they were paid well, but were they really being paid into how they were generating money for Major League Baseball? That's kind of a different thing that people have not looked at. So there's a way to look at the pay scale and what that means. Also, though, it doesn't exonerate anybody who throws the series, whether you're getting paid or not. And there was actually one baseball historian is theorized that the 1918 World Series was thrown by the Cubs to the Boston Red Sox, and that baseball economics in 1918 was a lot worse than in 1919. And because in 1918 they really thought that baseball would have to disband because of World War One, and a lot of players were not getting paid very well in 1918, probably less than 1919. So that the salary thing is complicated. It did contribute, but it does not exonerate the White Sox, or does not exonerate Charles Comiskey either.
And in the grand scope of things, it's not like today where the professional athletes are paid millions of dollars. And back then, they were probably on the pay scale, probably one of the lower paid in the working class people. And so, I mean, they were not, I would say some laborers were probably getting paid about the same amount, wouldn't you say? Yeah,
you can compare them to some people like that. And plus, it was one thing that was very sure, they had to have off-season jobs. This was not someone like, today players don't have to work during the off-season because they're paid millions and they could stay in shape. And and spring training was set up for people to get into shape. That's what spring training was for.
Right.
Now spring training is not for people in shape, it's just to get some live action. But
Right.
they work out during this off-season because they have plenty of time to do so.
Yeah. So let's get into the story a little bit more, and then we'll talk about the book signing coming up. So we talked about their pay and why this may happen. Let's talk about the players that were involved. We had the most famous out of all of them was Shoeless Joe Jackson, and then some of the others.
Well, the main two that really helped in this throwing the series was Eddie Sycote, who was their starting pitcher, and Claude Lefty Williams was another pitcher. Between them in the 1919 regular season, they won 51 games between themselves.
Wow.
Sycote won 29, and I believe Williams won 22. In the 1919 World Series, these two guys who won 51 games in the regular season, in the World Series, they won 1 and lost 5.
Wow.
The 5 losses that eliminated the White Sox came at the hands of their 2 best pitchers.
Wow.
And then after Game 2, the catcher, Ray Shaw, confronted Lefty Williams, who started Game 2, and was ready to beat the hell out of him. Because as a catcher, he could see what the pitcher was doing. And he saw Lefty Williams was throwing that second game.
Yeah, man, it's kind of interesting though. Now the tie into this was obviously there were some professional, I guess you would call them the syndicate or the betting industry back then that actually spurred a lot of this to happen. Who were those people? I mean, was that brought up in the investigation at all? Who the people that were trying to get these players paid?
Well, the people, Major League Baseball, who knew some of them were. One was a guy named Arnold Rothstein from New York, and he was the one who bankrolled most of this. Okay, yeah, they knew who they were, but they walked away from it with no problem. The people who suffered for it were the players, and the players did not realize that the gamblers didn't care about Major League Baseball; they cared about money, and the ironic thing, Arthur Roasting, who bankrolled most of this, eventually, about 10 years later, was murdered because he refused to pay money that he lost in a poker game, and he said he would not pay because he said the poker game was fixed. So someone shot him.
Oh, ironic.
Yes.
Oh boy. Well, yeah, it's interesting. So, talk to us a bit more about this and how it happened. What happened afterwards? Because this changed baseball as we know it forever afterwards because of the changes that had to take place.
Well, what happened afterwards is that, first of all, what baseball took was a very hard stance towards these 8 players. They went to trial and was found not guilty. So in a legal sense, they didn't do anything wrong, legally. There was actually no laws against throwing a Major League Baseball game. But what happened after that, once they got thrown out, that the baseball was trying to crack down on gambling more and more. And so you had several more players in the 20s who actually was banned from baseball, even they were suspected of doing it. And what happened, basically, even in the 70s, after Willie Mays retired, he was starting to work for a casino, and baseball told Willie Mays, you can't work for baseball as long as you're working for that casino. So anybody who had any kind of connection to gambling at all, baseball came down on. That doesn't mean that they knew everybody who was doing it. And sometimes they turn the other way. But if someone was even suspected of it, they were in big trouble. And so they were trying to get gambling out of baseball, because gambling was so much part of baseball when this happened.
Now, the interesting thing I find here, fast forward to the 70s, we have another person that played for one of these teams, which actually suffered a lifetime separation from baseball.
Pete Rose.
Pete Rose. Yeah.
The ironic thing about Pete Rose is that, first of all, in the 70s, I mean, the Dow report came out, I think, in the late 80s, talking about Rose's involvement in gambling. Baseball knew about Pete Rose long before that.
Yeah.
Peter Ueberroth, who was commissioner in the late 70s, was trying to talk to Rose about his gambling connections. They knew that he was gambling and he was getting himself in trouble. This was something that they covered up for some time. We don't know hardly anything about Pete Rose. Right now, they stopped their investigation of him once they suspended him. Mm-hmm. We don't know half of what happened with Pete Rose. Yeah. So that was bad news. Pete Rose is bad news.
Yeah, I know this. I wouldn't want to be a shortstop or a second baseman and have that guy slide into me. Man, he brutalized some shortstops and second basemen and third basemen and then catchers.
The famous collision he had was with Ray Fosse in the 1970 All-Star game.
Yeah.
and ruined Foster's career. That game didn't even count. It was an all-star game. There was no excuse for what he did.
Yeah. No, but he had the athleticism of Walter Payton, and then the muscles of Walter Payton, the speed. I mean, he stole some bases, and he wasn't a leader in the league, but boy, that's why they call him Charlie Hustle. Well, we're getting off topic here. When we come back way back earlier in the century and talk about that. Now, one thing that happened, of course, is baseball was restructured after this. This is kind of like a major time when they had to sit back and say, okay, we can't allow this to happen, which you talked about. And so talk about how they restructured baseball.
Well, in the one major way they restructured it anyway, was that they established a baseball commissioner. And basically what there was always infighting between the presidents of both leagues and with the owners and the presidents of both leagues. And what they did was they gave the commissioner a great amount of power. And basically what they said was the commissioner can do anything he wants as long as he deems it in the best interest of baseball. So when the commissioner Landis fired the 8 players or banned the 8 players for life, that was his decision. It wasn't challenged, and he never reversed it. And commissioners after him obviously didn't reverse it. And it was interesting in the 1970s, about 1976, Charlie Finley sold 3 of his players, 2 to Boston, I think 1 to another team. And Bowie Kuhn was the commissioner, and he came forward and stopped and negated the sales. He said this kind of thing is against the best interest of baseball, and those players had to go back to the A's.
Now, what's interesting about the first commissioner that they picked, he had some interesting qualifications that kind of, I guess, legally gave him an edge on making legal decisions.
Yeah, he was a federal judge.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's I kind of find interesting.
Which is interesting because then after they went to trial and found not guilty, and he didn't care about that. It was like, I don't know if he would felt about it was that in his courtroom, but he ignored the legal proceedings. And the day after they got out of court, they and this White Sox players were celebrating. They thought they were going to play ball again. He says, "Think again, because you're not coming back." I'm the commissioner of baseball. That's all that matters.
Yeah. And I guess before we move on to talk more about the book signing, what we're going to have here this weekend, is the one of the famous headlines that came out of this whole thing is, Joe, tell us it ain't so.
Say it ain't so.
Say it ain't so, yes. And that had to relate to Shoeless Joe Jackson,
Right.
which was one of the 8.
An event that never happened. What it was supposed to have happened, or in my opinion, never happened. What was supposed to have happened, he was coming out of the courtroom, out of a grand jury meeting session, and a boy about 10, 11 years old came up to him and said, "Say it ain't so." And he said, "I'm afraid it is," or something to that effect.
Yeah.
Joe Jackson, to the day he died, denied that ever happened. He said he never talked to any boy. He never said it was so. He basically said that a reporter for the Chicago Tribune made it up, and there was no such encounter. However, a man came forward probably in the late 70s, and by this time he's 70-some years old, and he says, "I was the boy. I was the one who came up to him." And then he passed away a few years later, but his mother, his wife, and his son backed him up and said, yes, he was the man. He came forward, and he said that to Joe Jackson. However, there's one other thing. There is some film of Joe Jackson coming out of that grand jury courtroom, and there is no image of a boy there on the street. So whatever happened is up to debate. Most people say that the so thing is fabrication, and it did not happen.
No. So it's going to be interesting. I want to get this and try to read up on it, because you've always heard myths and what happened, and one of the rumors was that Shoeless Joe got railroaded, but then it comes out later that, well, not really. There was like a separation there. But again, the book's name is the 1919 Black Sox Scandal. And again, it has to do with the 1919 World Series and the scandal of the 8 players on the White Sox being incriminated as far as throwing the game. And so it's definitely going to be an interesting read. Most importantly, Dan will be here this weekend, Saturday, September 28th, from 11:30 to 2 p.m. here at Miles Books in Highland, Indiana. And the address here is
What's the address?
2819 Jewett Avenue.
2819
2018 Jewett
Now the
Ave.
amazing thing is, it's the same street you go to where the library is. Now it goes from avenue to street. Go figure. Not trying to complain or anything like that, but it's like two different universes.
We'll
There you
put up
go.
a map up on the screen
Yes,
showing
we'll
you
let
how
you
to
know
get
how
to
to get
Miles
here.
Books. And so Dan will be here during that period of time signing books. And by golly, if you're interested in talking to him about the 1919 World Series and any of the events that happened, by golly, and or any of his
other books too. Yeah, absolutely.
which are just as intriguing.
Yeah.
And the
Dallas Forever Changed, which I've read, and the Highland book. Oh, amazing.
Yeah. So by all means, come out and enjoy a conversation with Dan and pick up the book. It will be very enjoyable. So with that, is there anything else you want to say before we leave?
No, I think we've got it covered.
All right.
We covered
Cool.
everything. Good.
And again, it's this Saturday, September 28th, from 11:30 to 2 p.m. Here at Miles Books, and there'll be book signing going on and conversations about White Sox.
That's right.
But Cubs fans are welcome.
Absolutely.
Right, Demetrius? If you want to buy a book, you're welcome. All right, with that, we'll say goodbye for now. Goodbye.
This episode of The Bill and Callie Show is brought to you by, since 1984, Miles Books has been the region's family-run independent bookstore with over 72,000 titles of new, used, and antique books, and the ability to find and order rare or specialized titles. Certified book appraisals are also available. Located in downtown Highland on Jewett Avenue. Follow them on Facebook for sales, author book signings, and special events.